Week 6, Chapter 1, Master Studies Using Simple Value Thumbnails. To start us off, I'm going to have this artwork by Rembrandt van Rijn, and we're going to do a quick study of this. So here I am in Photoshop, and I'm using very simple brushes. This is a Photoshop default, just a simple round brush, and the only thing different on this is the size that's changing when I have a little bit more pressure to my pen. From here, I'm going to start off by doing a quick thumbnail study. But instead of drawing it out, to my left over here, I'm going to use a marquee tool. So I'm going to right click and switch over to my rectangular marquee tool. So I can change the size depending on how I drag the cursor. Okay. Now for this one, I'm going to do my best to match the aspect ratio. It doesn't have to be the exact same size, but the ratio, I want to make sure that I get that correct. So I'm going to eyeball it about this size. So what I'm going to do now is go to Edit, go to Stroke, and from here I'm going to use a pixel width of 5 pixels. And what that's going to do is going to create a line for where the marquee tool was indicating the whole rectangle. Just to check my aspect ratio. And if you get it a little bit off, what you can do is right click and do a free transform to change your length and width. So once you're pretty satisfied with that, we can start with our study. Just like our previous week, we're going to keep this study very simple by using just 2 values. So we're going to just use the white of the canvas. And for now, I'm just going to use either 90 or 100% for the darkest tone. From here, I could just color pick, fairly straightforward. So when you do this, I recommend zooming out or making sure you're drawing small enough that you can get the big shapes fairly easily. For this demonstration, that way you guys can see, I'm going to do my best not to zoom out too much. But when you're working on this, sometimes I like to work super small. That way I can see the whole composition. But on your page, make sure you have a pretty decent size, just like the thumbnails we did from week 5. So even though this is a human figure, I'm trying my best not to get caught up on any details, and I'm just using very simple shapes. So I'm squinting my eyes, and I can see that there's a clear separation between light and shadow on his face, and that's the kind of shape I'm going to try to capture. There's a clear white highlight here that I'm going to mark off. Now there's a lot of detail in here, but when I squint my eyes, they kind of merge together. The one that stands out the most is this white highlight. Okay, so from there, what we're going to do is take this and just block in the rest of the shadows. If you need to, you could separate as many lines and shapes as you need in order to block in the areas of light and shadow. But at the same time, you don't want to spend too much time on this where you're just focused on every single little detail. As you can see, we're just keeping it very simple, 2 values. So you can easily do this with your markers for traditional mediums, or your graphite, or even pens. My personal favorite for doing studies like this is actually just using a large Sharpie marker to just block in all the darks and leave my whites with the paper. So as I squint my eyes, I can see there's a light area over here, which I'll leave. So if I squint my eyes, this whole area is actually in shadow, and it almost merges in with the background. So with that in mind, I'm going to keep it all dark in that area. So here there's actually a bit more of a pocket of light, so I'm going to fix that out. So that's the first one. It's a very quick study, not 100% accurate, but at least I'm getting close to the aspect ratio and the shapes I see up there when I squint my eyes. So zooming out, you can see that they kind of have the same resemblance in terms of capturing the whole composition with simple black and white values. Next, we have some sample artwork by Mead Schaefer, which are the first 2 illustrations to the left. And we also have a landscape painting here by Edgar Payne. This is the section I was referring to earlier, where you'll be pausing this video in order to try the studies out for yourself before I do them myself and show you what type of results you should have come up with. I will mention in a minute on when to pause this video, but first I want to give you some instructions and pointers on how to go about these studies. Just like I did with the previous Rembrandt painting, you want to do a quick study using only 2 values, basically just black and white. Keep them at about the same size as a thumbnail we did from the previous week. Just be sure to get the aspect ratio to match the artwork you are studying. Also, I want you guys to set a timer for yourself with a maximum of 5 minutes for each one. This will ensure you are not getting distracted with doing small details and spending way more time than you need to. You also don't want to rush these, as you want to make sure they are clear enough that we can tell which piece you did the study from. And last reminder, you can do these in any medium of your choice, whether it's on paper or on your computer. Alright, so keep those in mind, and you can pause this video in 3, 2, 1. Alright, so I hope everyone has followed the rules and gave this a shot on their own before continuing with the video. From here, I've gone ahead and sped up the demonstrations as I'm basically walking through the same steps like I did with the Rembrandt painting. And if you're curious, this set took me about 3 to 4 minutes each. I definitely spent a bit more time with the first one as the shapes were a little bit smaller. Now, the main thing about these studies is I want you to get familiar with some of these shapes and just seeing the composition as a whole. Now, there might be a few areas here that are a little bit off or not as accurate, but just do the best you can in order to capture the overall picture. But hopefully the training we've done weeks 1 through 5 has given you enough practice to try to eyeball these and estimate where they go based on your framing. Now for the second piece by Mead Schaefer, the illustration in blue, some of you might be surprised on how I broke down this image. Now while there are more than just 2 values in the scene, there's a specific reason I chose this piece and the way I broke it down in the thumbnail as you see here. Now when it comes to the overall composition and being able to see the shapes of those figures, I will go a little bit more in depth about that specific composition. But the way we are separating these 3 paintings, even though they're from different artists, including the Rembrandt one, they all have something in common, which I will elaborate on for the second chapter. Now the reason I'm having you do this on your own at first, instead of walking you through the whole thing, is I want you guys to be able to determine on your own on what we're trying to look for as we break these images down. So at the very end, you should have something similar to this set, where I've broken down the shapes in just 2 values and kept things as simple as I can. From here, we have finished the first set out of 3, and now for the second grouping, I'm going to show you a slightly different way of doing these thumbnails. And this is exclusive to the digital medium in a way. Now this is a common technique used in the industry, and for those of you that are already quite familiar with Photoshop. But what we're going to do is use our selection tools over here in order to do the thumbnail. Now this is totally optional, but I highly recommend this for those that are having trouble simplifying and can't look past the details. So to start off, we are going to get the marquee tool again and try to get the aspect ratio. Now instead of the stroke under edit, we are going to the fill or shift F5 for my shortcut. I'm going to fill it with a certain color. I'm going to do a medium gray. That'll fill my shape. I'm going to start a new layer over here that I'm actually going to use in order to kind of paint on or put some color on top of. But on a side note, I also need to talk about how we're going to approach this type of painting in certain amount of values. So for the first set, we only used black and white. For this one, we are going to use anywhere from 3 to 4 values. So first we have the white value of the actual canvas. Next up, I'm going to have a 30% gray. For my third value, I'm going to pick the same thing as I use for my background, which will become part of the study itself. And lastly, we're going to just use 100% for the darkest values. So there you have it. We have 1, 2, 3, 4 values in order to do this study. Now besides using our brush tools, I mentioned that we're going to do this a little bit differently. So for this canvas, which I'll name on this layer, we're actually going to be painting on this layer 2. But the biggest difference, instead of just going in here with a brush, we are going to right click on the layer and create clipping mask. Now this layer 2, or this painting layer, needs to be on top of the canvas layer. You'll see it denoted by this L-shaped arrow. And if I were to release the clipping mask, it goes back to normal. So when I hit create clipping mask, what happens is those brush strokes that I put in there is only being seen with the pixels that have been painted on that canvas layer. So no matter how large of a painting stroke I make, it's only being shown attached to that clipping mask that it's on top of. So that way I don't have to worry about passing this border. So again, we could always cancel this, and when I release the clipping mask, you can actually see the marks that I made. Right. So I'm going to erase those marks on that painting layer. Now I also mentioned that I'm not going to be using my brush set exclusively for this painting, and I'm mainly going to be drawing with the lasso tools. So here if I right click, you can see the lasso tool and the polygonal lasso tool. So we're going to start with this one, and what this does is you can create a freeform selection as if you were drawing with a pen. Now from there, while that's selected, I can take either my brush and paint in that section, or I can go to this layer, go to my paint bucket tool, and fill it in like so. What you'll see me do is try to draw this out, maybe starting with her hair as a selection. Now you do have to hold down, and then once you let go, it'll snap into place and create a complete shape for that selection area. Now her hair is dark, and if I squint my eyes, it'll belong in this 100% black. So we can either use the paint bucket tool right here when that's selected in order to fill it in. From there, you could go with whichever other selections you want to go first, but I think I'm going to continue to work with those black areas. So here you'll notice that if I select this area, my original selection disappears. So what you want to do, so up here in the lasso tool selection area, there are different set of options. So this one over here, so for the second option with the 2 squares filled in, it will let you add to those selections you've already made. So going back in here, you'll see a plus sign on the lasso tool. And now I could even add to it if, let's say, I wanted to draw a circle. But let's say I did that and made a mistake. You can go to the subtraction option next to it, denoted by the blank square next to the solid one. And with the subtraction lasso, whatever you select will be subtracted from the initial selection. So this is a great way to mask off different areas of the piece without worrying about the original selection disappearing. And then from there, I'm just going to get my paint bucket tool and just fill it all in with that same value. Next, I'm going to do the selection of the white area here in the front. And that shape is fairly complex, and I usually have to hold this down. So what I'm going to use is the polygonal lasso tool. And instead of holding it down, you can click it into place. But just note, it's going to be more of a straight line. And once you go to the other end, it'll complete that selection. So from here, I'm going to take my eyedropper tool, select the white, go back to my paint bucket, and fill in that area. Now if I squint my eyes, I can see that the face is really bright as well. But in order for me not to block it in with this same white value. I do have a fourth one, which is this 30% gray. We could fill it in with that value. And then from there, the background and this blue section of this furniture, they're about similar values, so I'm going to leave that alone. And it's in the same realm as this 60% gray that I've already determined for my canvas. So again, this is completely optional, but this might be a way for those of you that are struggling with trying to draw in every single little detail. We are just trying to get the overall impression and value breakup in this design. Now, if you want to do some finishing touches, you could do so with the lasso tool or go back to the brush at the very end to tweak some of the shapes. So from here, I can definitely put in her features, which is a strong part of this composition, being that it has a high amount of contrast. However, I'm going to leave it as is in order for you guys to see what kind of value breakup that you need to get for this set. Now, just like the last one, I'm going to show you a different set of artwork for you guys to try it on your own with this sort of value breakup. For the second set, besides paintings, I've also included a screenshot from the Sicario movie so we can try a quick film study. The guidelines are basically the same as the ones you did before. However, you will need to use 3 or 4 values to break down and simplify your thumbnails. We can also change the time limit to 7 minutes for each study, as we've thrown in a few extra values in order to determine the design. With that said, you can pause this video in 3, 2, 1. So I hope you guys had fun with that set and also hopefully a bit of a challenge. Now the reason these are a bit challenging is of course we're using more values, and the way these artists broke up their design definitely requires us to use more than just 2 in order to determine the type of design breakup they're using for their composition. And that's basically the biggest hint I have from determining the differences between this set and the previous one we did with the 2 values. From here, I'm using a combination of the lasso technique and filling in my shapes. But when it comes to the smaller areas, I just use a brush, that way I can just cover the smaller details a little bit quicker. Out of these 3, the one I found the most difficult was the first one by Uglo. That's because the value breakup that Uglo is using for the still life with the flower is very subtle on those leaves. When I squint my eyes, I basically see the same values as the blue and the green, and they're kind of getting mixed in together. So with my limited values that I'm using, I just chose to omit that area, as the higher contrast is in the brown stem. The second illustration by Bernie has a bit more subtlety for sure, but I'll elaborate it on the second chapter as there are different things going on with that one. But either way, I'm able to break it down with about 4 values in order to capture the design. When it came to the film study, I definitely changed some of my simpler values to go a little bit lighter, as the scene required basically just a black with 3 lighter tones sort of towards the middle. Now, even though this is the live action, you'll see later on how this shot in particular has a very specific way that it reads. Even though this section is sped up in terms of the demonstration, the techniques I'm using are exactly the same as the slower demonstration before the set. I'm using several layers in order to clip it on top of the base layer, which constructs the overall frame or canvas that's underneath. From there, the last tip I have in terms of doing these studies is, as much as I know a lot of you might want to try to get the very accurate shapes, what's more important than that is definitely the placement and the way you're putting the values in certain sections. From there, these are pretty much finished in terms of the type of studies that we are doing. So hopefully you guys got something fairly close to this in terms of your thumbnails that you did. Next, we are going to do one more set, which will conclude this last part of the chapter. For this final set, we're going to do something a little bit different since this chapter is getting pretty long. And also, we've actually been doing this for the first few weeks. So towards the end, there won't be a set of these for you to draw from. So just to get the practice in, I want you guys to at least follow along as I do this thumbnail. So this section is the hardest, but it can also be the easiest at the same time. Now the reason for that, you're basically trying to draw this out. You only need one value. Any simple tool will work. But also requires to get a lot of what's going on in this image. So it's actually pretty hard to get the thumbnail and capture it with either multiple values or just looking for big overall blocks of shapes. If you can, what I recommend is to shrink this down on your computer screen or wherever you're using to watch this lecture. That way you don't get too bogged down on the details. Now, just like the other one, it's really tempting to try to go in here as accurate as possible. But I'm just trying to get the overall read of this piece of art. For this one, I'm using a basic round brush, just that I like to use for drawing. Now there are other lines in there that are a lot lighter, but when I squint my eyes, this is sort of what I see in terms of the overall composition. Now this was done as a preliminary by Alphonse Mucha in order to do a larger painting or lithograph that he usually did for these advertising companies. Even though this isn't the full colored piece, this is a great piece of art in itself, and we can still relate this to the type of art in this category that we're going to look at. And again, this is something we've been doing for the first few weeks in this term, so this one's pretty easy to figure out. Now with that said, this is the last part of the chapter, and this is the third element that we are going to categorize in this week's design lecture.